A warm welcome to this lesson series on the introduction to the Constitution of India. In today's lesson, we will be briefly studying about the fundamental rights. Before we get into the details, it is important for us to know that the fundamental rights are contained in Part 3 of the Constitution, which extends from Articles 12 to 35. Also, we can consider this the most important part of the Constitution because it is from this part that we receive the fundamental rights. It is from this that the citizens and the people residing in India are truly empowered. Now, what are fundamental rights? You see, fundamental rights are the most basic human rights. Let's think of it like this. When we talk of rights, then rights can be given to human beings, and you'd also appreciate that it can be given to non-human beings, like for example, animals. So you do know that there are animal rights and animal right activists. So when we talk about human rights, then we are basically talking about the rights of human beings. Now, amongst the rights that are available to human beings, there are some basic human rights, okay? So these basic human rights, the most basic amongst these human rights are the fundamental rights, which means they are extremely fundamental, extremely important, and therefore they are mentioned as fundamental rights. There are some more features as to what makes a fundamental right. A fundamental right would be enshrined in the Constitution of India, which means that it is mentioned in the Constitution of India. So, the basic human rights which are mentioned in the Constitution of India in Part 3, those become fundamental rights. And it is important for you to know that these are guaranteed. So, now we understand as to what fundamental rights are. Fundamental rights are human rights. Yes, so every fundamental right is a human right. However, the most basic amongst the human rights are fundamental rights, and they become fundamental rights only when they are contained in the Constitution of India. And it is important for you to remember that these are guaranteed to the persons or citizens. So as we know, we'd seen that Part 3 contains the provisions relating to fundamental rights that extend from Article 12 to Article 35. However, we can see all of these provisions under 6 major headings. We'll look at them one by one. The first is right to equality from Article 14 to Article 18. Then we see the right to freedom from Article 19 to 22. It is in this bracket that you find rights such as the right to freedom of speech or the right to freedom of assembly and to form unions. You also find the right to trade, etc. Then we have right against exploitation. So these rights prevent the exploitation of a person through forced labor, bonded labor, and it also protects child labor in cases of hazardous places of work. Then India is a secular country, and therefore there is the protection of the right to freedom of religion. Therefore, any person in India can profess, practice, and propagate his religion. Likewise, we have to ensure in India that there is unity in diversity, and therefore minority rights are protected under Article 29 and 30, whereby they can protect their culture and also have educational institutions to protect their interests and their culture. Last but not the least, right to constitutional remedies. Now this is very important. You see, it is one thing to have a right. Okay, so a law may give you a right. Let us say you have the right to equality. However, it is useless unless you are also given a remedy. Which means that let us say a right is violated. Someone does not respect your right. Then what do? If you do not have a remedy, then the right becomes meaningless. So when we see the 6th heading here under Article 32, you get the remedy for these rights, which means that if your right is taken away, if your right is abridged, then you have a remedy. Now I'll take you through these rights in the Constitution. We'll have a look at the Constitution, and you can see in the contents that all of these things are mentioned. So we can see that here we have part 1, the articles. We move down until we reach part 3. So as you can see, part 3 is fundamental rights. Okay, it starts with 12 and 13 that have the heading of general. We'll discuss this in a bit. Then there's right to equality, which we've spoken of, right to freedom, which we've again spoken of, right against exploitation. Here you can see forced labor, employment of children in factories. Then you go to freedom of religion, and then you can see the cultural and educational rights. And then we also spoke of the right to constitutional remedies, where I spoke about Article 32. Of course, then there's part 4, which talks about the DPSP, which we will discuss later on. But as you can see, there are these various headings between 12 to 35 that are important for you to understand. So if you noticed, in our 6 headings, we had begun from Article 14, which spoke of right to equality. So what do we have in Articles 12 and 13? They're very important provisions. Article 12 tells you as to what the state is, right? And this is very important because you should know that fundamental rights are available only against the state. Let me give you an example. Let us say this is a father of 2 sons. Now, this father has, let's say he has 2 mangoes with him. So he has 2 mangoes. But what he does is that he gives both of these mangoes only to one son. So what he does is that he gives both these mangoes only to one son, and this son gets absolutely nothing. So now, has there been equal treatment of these 2 sons? The answer is no. So does that mean his right to equality under Article 14 has been violated? The answer to this is no, because the person who has violated it is not the state. This father is not the state, right? And the rights, the fundamental rights, are available only against the state. Largely, there are some exceptions. I will talk about it in a bit. But largely, the fundamental rights are only available against the state. Therefore, this is not a violation of Article 14. So Article 12 is very important because it tells you against whom this fundamental right is available. On the other hand, let us say there were 2 persons who went for a government job. So you have 2 candidates who went for a government job, okay? And here they went for a government job. Now these 2 people have to be treated equally because this appointing agency is the state, and therefore if it does not treat these 2 people equally, then that would be a violation of Article 14. So this is why it is very significant and very important for us to know as to what the state is. Article 13 is also very important. Article 13 says that if there is a law that is in derogation of fundamental rights, which basically means if there is a law that is in opposition of fundamental rights, or if it abridges fundamental rights, then such a law is not valid. Which means, let us say you have the right to equality under Article 14. Now let us say tomorrow there is a new law, and that new law goes contrary to Article 14, it is opposite to Article 14. Then Article 13 says that you cannot make new laws which are in derogation of fundamental rights. You cannot make a new law to take away, to abridge a fundamental right. So as you can see, Article 13 is also very important in protecting the fundamental rights. I will briefly discuss with you some of the features of fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are justiciable. Now what that means is, if your fundamental rights are taken away, then you can knock the doors of the court. You can knock the doors of the court, which means you can receive a remedy. And also, it's important for you to know that it is not just any ordinary right. Let us say any of your ordinary rights is violated, you can still go to the court. However, when your fundamental right is violated, you can go straight to the Supreme Court. This is a very important point, and that is what is given to you under Article 32, which gives you the right to constitutional remedies. We had discussed this a little while back, and now I will tell you this in a little detail. So, when you have the violation of an ordinary right, then you will first have to go to the lower court. Then maybe you go and appeal, and then finally you might reach the Supreme Court. However, when a fundamental right is violated, let us say your fundamental right is violated, then you can go straight away to the Supreme Court. And therefore, fundamental rights are very important. You can see that they're so important that a citizen can approach the Supreme Court directly. Okay, so this is what you have under Article 32, which is the right to constitutional remedies. Also, you should know that under Article 32, this remedy that you have is also called the writ jurisdiction, right? So you must have heard this word writ, and this deals with the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in matters wherein there has been a violation of a fundamental right. Let's look at some more features of these fundamental rights. Fundamental rights cannot be easily amended. Let us say you have a fundamental right. Let's say you have Article 14. Is it possible for Article 14 to be amended or maybe removed or maybe changed or reduced? The answer to this is no, because fundamental rights form what is called the basic structure of the Constitution. I will discuss this ahead in our video on the amendability of the Constitution, but fundamental rights form a part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and therefore they cannot be amended so as to deny the citizens that fundamental right. Also, it is important for us to know the difference between a citizen and a person. Now, a citizen of India is different from a foreigner, right? So, as you might presume, a citizen in India gets more rights than a foreigner who obviously gets less rights. For example, if I talk of Article 15, which means that you have equality in terms of employment, okay? Or we saw the rights under Article 29 and 30, whereby a person can protect his or her cultural identity. These are not rights that are available to foreigners. So these are only for citizens. So some rights are available only for citizens. However, there are some rights that are also available to foreigners, regardless of whether they're a citizen or not. For example, you have Article 21, right? So Article 21, which talks about right to life, this is available to not only citizens but also foreigners. Therefore, you can see that Article 21 is available to all persons, whereas something like Article 15 or Article 29 are available only to citizens. So it's important for you to notice this whenever you see the provisions relating to fundamental rights. Also, during an emergency, some fundamental rights can be suspended. However, there are some fundamental rights that cannot be suspended even during an emergency situation. For example, you have Article 20 and you have Article 21. You can go ahead and read them. These provisions cannot be suspended even during an emergency. However, some provisions like Article 15, like we just saw, can be suspended during an emergency. So we have understood these 6 categories of fundamental rights. You can go ahead and read them in more detail if you're interested. But I want you to notice something now. Here you see that this goes up to Article 30, and then here you have Article 32, which leaves out Article 31. Okay. So Article 31 used to be a fundamental right to property. So earlier you had a fundamental right to property. However, after the 44th Amendment Act, which took place in 1978, you no longer have a fundamental right to property. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a right to property. Right to property is no longer a fundamental right, it is only an ordinary right. So we just saw the difference between an ordinary right and a fundamental right. So this is a good example for you. Earlier we had 7 categories of fundamental rights because you would have had a 7th here, which was right to property. However, now right to property is an ordinary right that you can find in Article 300A of the Constitution. So you now can see the difference between a fundamental right and an ordinary right. Right to property is an ordinary right that is available under Article 300A of the Constitution. So I hope that with this, you have been able to learn something about fundamental rights. Thank you so much for your patience. Good day.